Hey Japan, this video is about you.
As well as a huge naval build-up, the Japanese thoroughly
Scared the
stopped
crap
Chinese.
out of
As a
me.
result,
Whoa, whoa, what? So I kind of just left Asia and went to the World War II stuff without even visiting one of the most important countries of the entire continent, and that is, you know, because you've already seen the title of this video, and I already said it in the intro. Now, I literally know nothing about the history of Japan and not a ton about the culture either, other than kind of what happened during World War II with the United States. And we've seen in previous videos that Japan did invade China and were somewhat successful with that, but that's all I know. Now, this video is a request from a viewer called Keppa GDLT. I don't know how you say the last part, but they said, react to the 10-minute history of the Meiji? I don't know how you say it. I'm sure we'll figure it out in this video. They go on to say, I feel like you don't know much about Japanese history after watching your videos on China. It's a very, very good point, because you're absolutely right. At first I was going to go all the way back to the beginning of Japanese history, which I'm still going to do, and then go all the way to present day, which we're still going to do. But then I was like, you know what, I'm just going to start with this and then see what happens. So I did some really quick research on this, because when I watch these videos, I like to know kind of what time frame we're in, because it helps give me some context for what's going on. And it looks like the Restoration started in 1868, and it kind of went through to signing something during World War II. So that kind of takes us up to where we've been in studying the Eastern Front of World War II, except we're on the other side of the world now. So I'm hoping that some of this kind of ties in with some of that we were learning. I've also gotten video requests for the attack on Pearl Harbor, and then also the American plans to invade the Japanese mainland. So I figure I should probably know something about Japan before we get to those videos, because it'll probably be more meaningful for me. I also had a friend who took Japanese, and he knew how to speak it and write the kanji and all of that, and he also visited Japan a couple of times. I always thought that the kanji was so cool. I mean, you guys get to draw your language out in pictures, which sounds like so much more fun than just writing out, you know, A-E-I-O-U. But I guess in the end, all letters actually are just pictures. They're just not as cool looking as, you know, kanji. It's always kind of been one of those abstract goals in my life where I wanted to kind of learn how to read and write kanji. I mean, what the heck, we might just throw caution to the wind and learn a whole new language on this channel. Wouldn't that be riveting content? Oh, and Roger wants to say hello. Wait, is that Japanese? I don't understand what you're saying. Wait, how do you know Japanese? Okay, you know what? Just stop, because you know what? You could be saying bad things about me right now to everybody, and I have no idea. You're not doing that, are you? Alright, you know what? Let's just watch the video.
1853, and the Americans are here. Where? Japan. Why? To open up the country. The man leading the American expedition was a certain Commodore.
I didn't know that the United States was messing around over there in Japan at that time. 1853. So this was pre-Civil War here in the United States. I didn't know we were kind of going out there and doing stuff in the Pacific at that time. Boy, I do not know enough about American history.
Commodore Matthew Perry, who essentially told the Japanese to allow America.
Apparently not to be confused with this Matthew Perry.
The man leading the American expedition was a certain Commodore Matthew Perry, who essentially told the Japanese to allow American imports or face war. For the previous 200 years, Japan had been closed to all foreigners under the pain of death,
bold
because as far as the Japanese were concerned, foreigners were a tad meddlesome. The orders to close the borders had come from the Bakufu, also known as the shogunate. The Bakufu.
Okay, we're gonna have to read this. The Bakufu is the name of the shogun's council. What's a shogun? There are a lot of restaurants here in the United States with the name shogun in the name, so I should probably know what it is, but I don't. Since he has a council, I'm assuming it's a leader of some sort. It was essentially a military dictatorship and held absolute power. Okay, so I guess the shogun is a dictator that has a council.
Bakufu was the central government of Japan, which was led by a shogun who lived in Edo. Technically, he was appointed by the emperor, who lived in Kyoto, but frankly, the emperor was just a puppet. Japan at this point was very decentralized, with regional.
So they have two leaders, kind of like the UK does. I don't know. I don't know how the UK government works. Is the Queen like the Queen of all of you guys, or is it just of England, or is it just of Britain? Somebody recommended that I watch a video to learn about how the UK, Britain, and all of that breaks down. I'm gonna have to do that soon because I feel like I don't know what I'm talking about. But what I was saying was that Japan looks like it has two different leaders, like a monarchy, the emperor, and then the shogun, which is more like the prime minister, but he's actually a dictator. And also it looks like we have a bunch of different states, kind of, in Japan.
Regional daimyo were able to set their own tax rates. It was also undergoing a period of major economic stagnation, and there were social tensions bubbling away under the surface. Inflation and famine swept the countryside, and many were noticing the increased wealth of the merchant class, despite them being at the bottom of the social hierarchy. It was within the context of this period of tension that the Americans had arrived, and they pledged to return a year later to hear the Japanese response. Apparently, Commodore
It looks like a lot of the Japanese were economically not doing so well at this point, and they saw that the American trade was kind of bringing in some benefits. So that kind of maybe shaped their opinions a little bit more to accept some of this trade and stuff going on and being not so closed off to the outside world.
Commodore Perry couldn't wait that long, and so returned about 6 months later, this time with more ships, and the Japanese signed a treaty to allow trade. And soon after that, the British arrived and gained a similar deal. By 1858, Japan had established formal relations and trading agreements with the US, Britain, the Russian Empire.
Sorry guys, I think there's going to be a lot of this pausing and reading. Foreign concessions. These trade treaties were extremely unequal and very pro-Western. The treaties were based upon the ones Britain forced upon China. Okay.
Russian Empire, the Netherlands, and France. These concessions to foreign powers made the Bakufu look weak. There were major splits among Japan's daimyo about how to respond to outside threats. To make things worse, the shogun was also dying and an heir had to be selected.
Opposing point of views
unity,
here.
The chief counselor of the Bakufu, Hotta Masayoshi, asked the Emperor Komai to give his approval to the trade deals and the shogun's heir. Well, the emperor said no, and Hotta resigned in shame. Some daimyo, such as that of Chosu, rallied against the shogun, and by 1866 Japan was in crisis. The new shogun, Yoshinobu, attempted to crush Chosu and to restore order, but was defeated when the daimyo of Satsuma refused to help. The Bakufu's defeat led Chosu and Satsuma to march on Kyoto, which they captured in 1867. Whilst there, the new Emperor Meiji announced the restoration of the emperor as the ruler of Japan. This kick-started what is known as the Boshin War, which the shogunate quickly lost. This was coincided with the modernization of Japanese military tactics on both sides.
So the restoration part of this is where the emperor wanted to kind of regain its true authority over Japan and get rid of the shogun and kind of his dictatorship. So was it the shogun that was more for the traditional stuff and the emperor that was more for the modernization, or was it the other way around? I'm kind of lost on that here.
Both sides had received help from the West. Having been victorious, Emperor Meiji moved from Kyoto to Edo, which was renamed Tokyo, from where he would run Japan. Over the next couple of decades, the imperial government began the process of nation building, such as by building a new shrine in Tokyo for Japan's war dead and by dismantling the social hierarchies of the past. The late 19th century also saw the creation of Japan's
so who's doing this?
Which was renamed Tokyo, from where he would run Japan. Over the next couple of decades, the imperial government began the process of nation building, such as by building a new shrine in Tokyo for Japan's war dead and by dismantling the social hierarchies of the past. The late 19th century also saw the creation of Japan's first political parties, who argued over important new issues, such as representation or whether or not Korea should be immediately invaded. The Japanese military went through a period of reform as well. For a start, Japan...
so they're allowing a lot of Western influence in their government at this point, it looks like. Also, the new military soldiers were expected to be loyal to the emperor and Japan, not their daimyo, Japan. The military had to be modern in case Japan had to resist the West. Okay, I see where this is going.
But Japan now had a national military which fought under one flag. At first, it consisted exclusively of samurai, but was reformed by Field Marshal Yamagata Aritomo, who introduced national conscription for all men over 20. Also during the closing decades of the 19th century, Japan underwent a period of massive industrialization. Railways started to spring up from 1872 alongside numerous textile factories, much of which was paid.
So this makes me wonder, would all of this have happened if America and the other Western countries had not come in and started to kind of influence Japan? Do you think they would have industrialized like this? Or would they have kind of stuck to the more traditional ways?
Which was paid for by the state. Of course, the state had other expenses, such as paying off samurai, who up until this point received an annual payment from the local daimyo. This payment, called a stipend, was carried over to the new imperial government and was very expensive. Needless to say, the government spending almost half of it...
So was the Japanese army pretty much just all samurai? before this? Because if so, that's really cool and I want to see that.
This income paying a bunch of samurai was controversial, and beginning in 1871 the government started to phase it out. So the samurai at this point were becoming quite upset. They were no longer at the top of the social strata, stopped receiving free money, and weren't even seen as the honourable defenders of Japan, since any old peasant could join the army now. This resentment led to the Satsuma Rebellion.
So did the samurai have kind of an elevated position in society? They were kind of seen as like a really honorable position in defending Japan? Because if so, that's kind of cool too.
Rebellion of 1877, which the new conscript army was able to crush quite handily. The major changes Japan underwent during the second half of the 19th century culminated in the 1889 Constitution. This constitution created a Western-style government with a prime minister who served under the emperor and with an elected lower
I doubt
house,
this would have
although the vast
happened if
majority of men
the
and
Western
no
countries
women
hadn't
could
come
vote.
over.
Culture at this time also underwent massive changes, and the people of Japan had the difficult task to define what it meant to be Japanese. The government attempted to aid the creation of a Japanese identity through the new education system. This, alongside conscription, was used to promote and foster a shared sense of identity. So Japan quickly found itself becoming an ambitious modern nation-state. And what was the one thing that all the great nation-states of the world had at this point?
This kind of makes me sad in a way. Seeing this guy holding up the sign, "We're just like you." It's like, I don't know. Maybe just be Japan, you know? You guys have a really unique culture. You don't necessarily need to be like us. But at the same time, you know, times do change, and sometimes you have to keep up with them if you want to still be relevant in the world. I don't know, it's just a really conflicting thing, right?
They had empires, which meant Japan wanted one too. This kick-started a period of imperial expansion. In 1875, Japan took the Ryukyu Islands, the best known being Okinawa. After that, Japan
So they're going to try and become an empire just like the Western
To people like
nations.
Aratomo, Korea was going to be conquered eventually, so it may as well have been by Japan. At first, using some good old-fashioned gunboat diplomacy, the Japanese signed their own treaty with Korea.
Well, they had
Eventually,
ships
the Japanese
by
presence
then?
in Korea led to what is known as the Donghak Rebellion. This massively destabilised Korea, and so both Japan and China sent troops in to protect their interests. These troops clashed and thus begun the First Sino-Japanese War. Because of the modernisation of the military, as well as a huge naval build-up, the Japanese thoroughly
scared
stopped
the
the
crap
Chinese.
out of
As a
me.
result, Korea formally entered Japan's sphere of influence, and Japan also seized Taiwan. China also ceded here the Liaodong Peninsula, but after threats from Russia, Japan gave it up. Japan wanted to be seen by Westerners as their equal. This didn't happen despite the fact that Japan actually provided the most troops and ships for the Eight-Nation Alliance, which put down the Boxer Rebellion in China between 1890.
I've heard of this before. Rebels were called Boxers. This is in China, right? Rebels were called Boxers because of the martial arts they practiced. Many Western soldiers took the opportunity to loot the cities they captured. Oh.
1899 and 1902. The Boxer Rebellion was essentially an uprising designed to remove foreigners from China, but these countries intervened and eventually the rebellion was crushed.
So we have the United States, France, Great Britain, or the UK, or what the heck, I don't know. We have, it looks like Germany, Italy, and I don't know what that red country is in the middle there, because I think nowadays there's like a bunch of different countries. What was that back then? And then of course Russia. So a lot of countries intervening.
Was crushed. The long-term effects were that Europeans were less meddlesome in China, except for Russia, who took the opportunity to seize Manchuria. So the only European country that took Japan seriously was Britain, who in 1902 entered an alliance with them. Importantly, Britain became the first Western nation to acknowledge the Japanese claim to Korea. In 1905, Japan sought similar acknowledgement from Russia, which they refused. In response, they launched a sneak attack against the Russian fleet in Port Arthur, thus starting the 1905 Russo-Japanese War, in which the Russians were firmly defeated. As a result, Japan gained this territory and Russia agreed to leave Manchuria. Very little happened in the next decade unless you were Emperor Meiji, because that was when you died, or unless you were Korea, because that was when you were annexed.
Meiji.
In 1914, Britain called Japan into World War I, which Japan used as an excuse to grab all of these German territories. It also used the chaos to issue the
Whoa, wait. Germany? You guys had territories out in the Pacific like that? What the heck? I had no idea.
Territories. It also used the chaos to issue the 21 demands to China. These were rejected and eventually only 13 of these demands were agreed upon. Japan gained influence over Manchuria, but it sowed division between Japan and Britain, as well as upsetting the United States. For its help during the war, Japan was invited to join in drafting the Treaty of Versailles and in establishing the League of Nations. Japan asked for the League to consider all races as equal. This was rejected formally by the Americans, but it was mostly because of Britain, since it would have meant that Britain had to consider its colonial subjects as equal.
Wow, that's interesting. Also, it looks like Japan is kicking China's butt right now, which really surprises me. Well, actually, it doesn't, because in the History of China videos, we did see Japan invade China and kind of do a lot of really horrible things. It's just kind of strange to me that an island, small island country like that would have that much power over China.
Eagles, which wasn't going to happen. In 1920, Britain abandoned the Anglo-Japanese alliance, and the next year, alongside the United States, convened the Washington Naval Conference. This sought to limit the number of large ships each country's navy.
Never heard of this before. So these are ratios. So the United Kingdom and the United States had the most ships, Japan second, and then France and Italy. Huh. I'm actually surprised that France and Italy, who are European countries, were not allowed to have as many ships as Japan. But maybe that's just because this is after World War I, and maybe the alliances were such that that is why they agreed upon those ratios. I just don't know enough about it to really understand why this is.
Navy could have, with only Britain and the United States being allowed the most. The next year, things wouldn't get much better for Japan due to a major earthquake which killed 150,000 people. Furthermore, the Japanese economy collapsed and the military
Wow. Wow, that is crazy. Look at that picture. This has to be a real photograph, right? I mean, that is destroyed. That looks like a post-tornado situation here in the United States. All of those people just walking around, they probably just don't have any idea what to do. I mean, I guess Japan gets earthquakes kind of like we do here in the States. It seems like that's kind of a frequent occurrence there. And I think that they now build their buildings to certain earthquake standards, but of course in 1923 they probably didn't have that in place, or if they did, maybe they didn't have the technology necessary to really withstand stuff like that. This had to be a pretty big earthquake on their Richter scale, I'm imagining.
Earthquake which killed 150,000 people. Furthermore, the Japanese economy collapsed and the military became much more influential in politics. In 1926, Emperor Showa, better known in the West as Emperor Hirohito, ascended the throne, and his reign saw the continued growth
this is
of
the guy that
empire.
was in charge during World War II, right?
On September 18th, 1931, a detachment of the Japanese army in Manchuria attempted to destroy a piece of railway. They blamed Chinese rebels, and this was used as pretext for invasion, and by February the next year, Manchuria was a Japanese puppet state. This was condemned by the League of Nations, and in response...
But Manchuria is part of China, right? I've heard of it a lot in the past, but I don't really know what it is. Is it just a particular region in China?
Japan withdrew, isolating itself. The army in Japan was becoming more ambitious, and in 1936 there was even an attempted coup by one of its factions. This was crushed by the emperor, who had given his support to another faction, but either way the military was effectively in control of Japan's government. The army wanted to further expand Japanese power, and this led to what is known as the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937, where Japanese and Chinese troops exchanged fire. The new Prime Minister, Fumimaro Konoe, who was originally where Japanese and China...
Considered by some to be the beginning of the Second World War, really? Now is that the Second World War period, or just this part of the Second World War? Because all I've heard about is Hitler's invasion of Poland, I think, that kind of kicked things off. Or maybe that's just like the European and American view of it. It led to Japanese forces occupying Beijing. Again, kicking China's butt.
And Chinese troops exchanged fire. The new Prime Minister, Fumimaro Konoe, who was originally appointed to reign in the army, authorised an invasion. Within a few months, the Japanese
what happened to
advanced all
Hirohito?
the way to Nanjing, where the infamous Nanjing massacre occurred.
Were they two different things?
Thousands of civilians were raped and murdered. In 1941...
Yeah, so that massacre, I did learn about that in the History of China videos that I did, and I was just like flabbergasted that Japan was able to invade China. In my eyes, China has way more people, they're a bigger country, and they're more powerful now, and so in my mind, I just equate China to being more powerful. So for a small island country like Japan to invade them successfully and do what they did with that massacre, it's just like, what the heck, China?
The United States under Franklin D. Roosevelt began an oil embargo against Japan. Japan refused to back down to what they saw as American meddling, and on December the 7th, 1941, launched the infamous attack on Pearl Harbor, which saw 4,000 American casualties compared to Japan's 65. At the same time, Japanese forces attacked the British colonies of Malaya, Singapore and Hong Kong. Initially, Japan did very well, winning major victories over the European powers, notably the Battle of Singapore in 1942, which saw 80,000 British soldiers surrender.
I don't really know anything about that.
By mid-1942, Japan held all of this territory, but its advances were stalling because it was too much territory to hold. Many of the European territories seized by the Japanese had puppet governments installed. Importantly, these governments were run by the native peoples there, which helped spur on independent movements even after the war. Japanese luck began to change when the American strategy of island hopping, as well as some major naval defeats such as the Battle of Midway and the Battle of Leyte Gulf, meant that Japan could no longer adequately project power. By the time the war in Europe was over, Japan had been pushed back all the way to here, and on August the 6th, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima, and 3 days later another one on the city of Nagasaki.
According to that map, Japan still held a lot of territory when we dropped the atomic bombs on them, and I was under the impression that they had already lost a lot of that territory. Okay, well, like I said before, you learn something new every day.
Nagasaki, killing an estimated 150,000 people. On September the 2nd, Japan formally surrendered to the Allies.
Oh, this is a cool picture. I've seen pictures of the surrender right here on this ship. I forgot what ship this took place on. Let me know if you know. But that looks like General MacArthur kind of in the middle with a really decorated hat. And I think he's got microphones in front of him. I think I've actually seen video of this. I think they filmed this. And then it looks like there are a bunch of representatives from other countries kind of in the front row right there. But I don't know what uniforms what. Other than, I know the French have like the really taller hats, right? So maybe the guy with the mustache and the tall hat is French? Oh no, he's probably not. I'm probably wrong.
The Allied forces and was occupied by the United States. The Americans financed a period of reconstruction, and a new constitution was completed in 1947 which still holds today, and it famously prevents Japan from declaring war. In conclusion, the Meiji Restoration saw the birth of a truly unified Japan. This Japan was a victim of many humiliations by Western powers who, despite Japan's achievements, refused to see it as an equal. The close relationship between military and politics in Japan led to an expansionist state whose ambition saw it even attack the United States, a decision that would ultimately lead to its destruction. It should also be noted that the Japanese occupation of many European colonies was the catalyst for those colonies seeking their own independence in the following decades. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching.
That last little bit there about those colonies wanting independence, at that point, I don't blame them because everybody was kind of fighting over their territory. And, you know, at that point, I would have just said, you know what, leave us alone, let us do our thing. Well, there's a lot of really interesting stuff in here that I learned. And even though we didn't really start from the beginning of Japanese history and we kind of jumped into the middle of it right here, I can understand why this would be a really fascinating period to study because it's kind of controversial, right? Where Japan had to modernize and kind of get away from its more traditional values. I would be interested though to learn more about what happened previously in Japan up to this point because I think that would give me more context for the importance of the Meiji Restoration. And we're definitely going to get into that. I also like that this led up into World War II, so maybe some of that will bleed over into the other World War II videos we're doing and kind of give a little bit more context for some of that. So let me know down in the comments if you have anything to add to this video or if you can answer any of my questions. You guys know that I do read your comments. I do try to respond to as many as I can. So just know that you're not writing into this huge void. So if you enjoyed this video, please do like it and subscribe. We will be getting back into the Eastern Front of World War II. I think we're going into 1943 next. So stay tuned for that. Roger, say goodbye. Alright, you know what? We're done. I'm gonna go learn some Japanese, I guess. We'll see you next time.